We start this evening with the growing tension between the United States and China, this time revealing itself from the world of basketball. Now, the National Basketball Association continues to face backlash, and the recent tweet made by Houston Rockets general manager when he showed support for the anti-government protests in Hong Kong. And even after he apologized, China isn't backing down. RT correspondent Sara Montes de Oca joins us to break all of the details down for us. Sara, it's just a tweet, but in this case, it's causing some major diplomatic and economic challenges.
That's right, Scottie. The backlash on the NBA over the apology really is continuing to grow. The NBA, like most businesses, have one thing in mind, and that's profit. The NBA is just the most recent company caught in the middle. They want to do business with China's massive economy, but have to be careful about saying anything that might upset the country. On Tuesday, China announced it would halt NBA broadcasts in the nation. This as backlash over the tweet, adding that it will immediately investigate all cooperation and exchanges involving the NBA. This is also after NBA commissioner defended the Rockets general manager tweet in support for freedom of speech.
Essentially, what I've said in that statement is the long-held values of the NBA are to support freedom of expression, and certainly freedom of expression by members of the NBA community. And in this case, Daryl Morey, as the general manager of the Houston Rockets, enjoys that right as one of our employees. What I also try to suggest is I understand that there are consequences from that exercise of in essence, his freedom of speech, and we will have to live with those consequences. It's my hope that for our Chinese fans and our partners in China, they will see those remarks in the context of now a 3-decade, if not longer, relationship.
China is one of the NBA's top international markets and a large market where Nike relies on business. But the sports company removed all Houston Rockets related products from their China store and their website. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang called for people to pay close attention to Chinese public opinion.
The Chinese Consulate General in Houston has made solemn representations to the Houston Rocket Club over erroneous remarks made by certain people of the club. The Chinese Basketball Association and the Chinese partner of the Houston Rockets have issued statements in succession. China's position is very clear. I suggest you pay attention to the reaction and the attitude of the ordinary Chinese people on this matter. It is not feasible to carry out exchanges in cooperation with the Chinese side without understanding China's public opinion.
The NBA has become a very popular sport in China within the last few decades. According to state media, there were an estimated 500 million viewers just last season. And league officials say more than 300 million players in China that play basketball. Now, despite the apology, many Chinese businesses have already cut ties with the Houston Rockets. An NBA community event scheduled to take place in Shanghai this week was also abruptly canceled. So it should be noted that for this event, it didn't include any of the players from the Houston Rockets, but it was still canceled. The Brooklyn Nets and the Los Angeles Lakers were scheduled to play in Shanghai on Thursday and in Shenzhen on Saturday, but no word of cancellation yet. But CCTV programming showed that it was no longer slated for broadcast. But they aren't the first American company who deal with China. The NBA is only another corporation that appears to be selling out to China for, of course, profit. Let me break it down for you and go through the list of American companies that have sided with China and kept their silence. This was especially prevalent 10 years ago during the Beijing Olympics when several companies were aware of human rights violations. Coca-Cola gave into Beijing when they cracked down on them really in advance for some of these games. General Electric also kept silence when an American Olympic speed skater, Joey Cheeks, was refused to grant entry because he criticized Darfur for its abuse. Johnson & Johnson was another who failed to call out China. This was when Steven Spielberg quit as director for the opening and closing ceremonies. Also after Beijing had failed to honor certain reform promises that it had made in order to host those Olympic Games. Other companies doing massive business with China include Starbucks, Ford, General Motors, Papa John's, Boeing, and GE, of course. So, Scottie, if NBA is being called out for doing this business with China, and it's only another company on that list, shouldn't the U.S. be calling out all of these other companies?
Well, that's the thing, Sarah. We can talk about the trade and the economic impact of all this, but I do find it funny that the Chinese government is calling out freedom of speech on an American tweet when here in the United States, our government actually chose to kind of stay out of it. Thank you, Sarah, for continuing to follow this. Now, we here like to always go further in depth, and we bring in Richard Wolff, professor of economics and co-founder of Democracy at Work. I mean, Professor, you're very intelligent. You watch this. I don't think even you could have predicted that this was going to happen and all of this attention was going to be put on because of a sport like the NBA, and yet it did. And today, because you're coming at this from an economic point of view, Chinese stocks tumbled. What do you think that means?
Well, I think the Chinese stock market tumbled for the same reason that people are watching very closely this explosion into the world of sports. What it illustrates is that when you start a war, any kind of war, economic, military, you name it, there are always massive, unexpected, unintended consequences. That's why you don't do it, and you certainly don't do it without thinking through what they might be. The United States has aggressively pursued a trade war for a little bit over 15 or 16 months, depending on how you count. President Trump told us he would win that war and he would win it quickly. Well, 15, 16 months later, it sure isn't quickly, and there's no sign that he's winning. But what has happened, the unintended consequence, is a heightened sense of defensiveness in China, that they are facing perhaps their greatest enemy since they've been around. They just celebrated their 70th anniversary. They're very worried. They're very anxious. And to have, literally out of left field, a sports figure talk about the struggle in Hong Kong as if it could be reduced to a question of more or less freedom, which is how the West plays it in the press. But everybody who knows anything about China knows it's much more complicated than that. To be surprised by this is to not understand that you have started now an economic war. I hope and pray that it doesn't become a military war like so many economic wars do, but you're picking up all the symptoms of an exaggerated, anxiety-ridden situation in which all kinds of wise and unwise things are done on both sides.
You know what, Professor Wolff, that's actually very insightful, and I'm glad that you bring that up. Now, I have to ask you, because you do know the economies of both China and the United States. In this situation, do you think China made the reaction they did of even calling out this tweet in the first place based on an economic and trade issues, and like you said, or do you think it was more about their stance with Hong Kong and that side of it? Do you think it's a combination of both?
It's a combination of both, but if you allow me, it really is about Chinese history. For the last 150 years, if not more, China has been parceled out, carved up between a variety of Western countries and Japan. Parts of China were taken by Japan. Parts of China were taken by Britain. Hong Kong was one of those parts. Britain imposed a 99-year lease on the Chinese to control a piece of their country. They finally got it back at the end of the 99 years. They've only been part of China now for a few years, and the Chinese see all of this as the great threat to their cohesive unity. And they're reacting more out of that history, more out of that massive feeling of being threatened by a hostile world than they are about the particularities of basketball or even of this trade war. But it's a sign that if you're not careful, you begin to touch many, many nerves. And the Chinese are wondering whether Mr. Mori's statement out of the Houston Rockets was just one man's opinion, which it might be, or is it part of the American attack? And if you put it together with the last couple days when Mr. Trump's government decided to penalize a group of Chinese institutions because of what is asserted the Chinese are doing to their Muslim minority, then this notion that we are under a broader and broader attack begins to make sense if you understand Chinese history, and that's what's crucial here.
You know what, you are exactly right. The history is playing a large role in it. So let's actually go with, I want to talk about, first of all, I want to look at President Trump. Do you think this, in combination with the controversy and what's going on in Hong Kong, is emboldening President Trump to be even more bullish in the United States in regards to this trade war? I mean, you're seeing both Republicans and Democrats united saying that we need to be on the side of Hong Kong in this issue. Is that emboldening him to kind of dig his heels in even more?
Absolutely. Just as the failure of Mr. Trump to get the Chinese to cave in is making them put their backbones up against the wall, be angry, be assertive in the case of this NBA quote, and so on. The two sides are polarizing. Mr. Trump is under attack by the Democratic Party. He's becoming more and more isolated. The whole world sees that. And so this is one of the very few issues where he can claim to be doing something that both parties support. The Democrats, who ought to be more critical about all of this than they have dared to be, are quiet, allowing him to play the role of the America firster without the kinds of criticism that he faced when he put those kids in cages in our Latin border, when he took various other steps, including the withdrawal from Syria that you're going to be talking about. So you see him using this one issue where he can get bipartisan support, but that makes him bolder. That provokes the Chinese. They provoke back. That's the syndrome that is so dangerous.
And I agree with you. And you know what? The thing is that the only thing I disagree with you in that whole statement is Democrats aren't being quiet. You do have Democrats, prominent Democrats even running for president, coming out, making very bold statements in support of the demonstrators in Hong Kong. So for the first time, China's been able to do the impossible, unite the Republicans and Democrats, and actually speaking out in support of the president. Thank you so much for joining us.
Democrats,
yes.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight, as always.
My pleasure.
Look at this remarkable squaring off, if you will, between China and the NBA. Why are they so hurt? Why are the Chinese so angry over something that most Americans probably are going to look at and say, what's the big deal here, right? And then there's a question of who really stands to lose on this issue, and by how much? Few people have a better feel for this story than Christy Ai. She's a U.S. businesswoman who was raised in the United States but emigrated from Shanghai with her parents. She's also the host of Boom Bust, we're proud to say, seen here daily on RT America. You know, Christy, I think where we need to start with this story is you are uniquely qualified to help us understand the Chinese perspective on this, because a lot of Americans are looking at this story and saying, oh my God, why are those Chinese people so upset about this?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think what they don't understand is they never got the full context or the history of China, which is something that the NBA Brooklyn Nets owner Cai Tongxing actually came out to address as well. He actually said that the reason why this is offensive to 1.4 billion Chinese people is because you are supporting a separatist movement. And this is highly offensive to all of China, and especially China's fundamental principle of being one China, two policy. It completely attempts to undermine it. And when it comes to China, there is absolutely no room for bargaining when it comes to their national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So to them, somebody in the United States, be it an NBA official or a politician or a media figure, literally coming out and supporting what Hong Kong is doing or what the protesters doing would be, I guess, akin to somebody in China supporting California wanting to leave the United States.
Exactly. When China doesn't have as good of a grasp of America and their history and why or how California wants to leave, how much money California generates, like, China has no idea. It's not fundamentally rooted in their conscience. So having it be an American, like, you have an entirely different view of what these protests represent, because in China these are actually riots, and essentially, like, that's what these protests are. These protests have what started out as peaceful protesting now have essentially turned into violent riots.
In fact, there was a report just 2 weeks ago that I read in the New York Times, which is no friend of China, by the way, where what they said was that about 90% of the people in mainland China are angry at the protesters in Hong Kong. So it's much more complicated than the way it's been presented, as I alluded to a little while ago. Let's move on to the issue of the economic impact. What might it be? And I understand boycotts are already underway.
Absolutely. So there are many companies who are vulnerable to this. Nike in particular, as Nike has relied on China for double-digit growth for the last 5 years. China has been Nike's biggest emerging growing market. And because of this, now a lot of people are being like, why should we buy Nike products when Nike is so closely affiliated with the NBA? We should just support domestic brands such as Li-Ning, or even outside of China, Adidas. Li-Ning has officially pulled out their sponsorship for the Houston Rockets, and now we all see that across the board. You have Shanghai Pudong Industrial Bank, you have Li-Ning, you have Slam Dunk Magazine, you have Tencent Streaming saying that we're going to stop streaming all of the NBA's games. So you have this entire boycott around the NBA, which currently derives 10 to 15% of their revenues from these sponsors alone.
10 to 15% of their
comes from sponsors.
So we're talking billions and billions of dollars that just went out the back door.
Exactly. This includes merchandising, licensing, streaming, broadcasting, play rights, etc.
All from one tweet.
Exactly. And you even have Alibaba, the Amazon of China, literally pulling out all of NBA products and even Rockets keywords. You can't even put that in a search bar right now for online consumer shopping.
You know what? It seems to me that this seems to be as much about respect as anything else.
Exactly.
It's personal.
Exactly. It's very personal. And that's what Yang Yi really tried to emphasize. He said that 你不能吃中国还骂中国, which essentially means you can't profit off of China and continue to criticize, offend, and degrade and condemn China.
Speaking of those terms that you just used, I get the feeling, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong, that had it not been for the embarrassing arrest of Huawei's founder's daughter in Toronto, essentially orchestrated by the United States, the Trump administration and the State Department, had it not been for the tariffs, had it not been for this trade war that's going on right now, China may have been upset about this, but may not have taken it to the nth degree as they seem to be doing. Am I wrong?
Not at all. Completely correct. They would not have had this entire blackout because this is very profitable for China too. China wants to support basketball. 500 million viewers want to watch basketball and be supportive of these teams. It's a growing sport in China, and China wants to be supportive of that. But if they have this clash with the NBA, if the NBA disrespects China and their one China policy, they have no other choice.
So you add this to the fact that they're still at war with the United States, and they're essentially digging their heels in and saying, look, we're tired of being offended. We're tired of being called cheaters. We're tired of all these things that have been said. True or not, we're tired of the offenses. And this may be their place to put their stake in the ground, as the metaphor says, right?
Exactly, because as in China, just like in America, most consumers aren't even aware of the trade war. They don't know the details of it, and because that only affects businesses. To consumers, tariffs are annoying. It makes products a little bit more expensive, but they didn't pay attention too much to it. But now when you put basketball, entertainment, you invite the consumers and the masses to all join in on the conversation. Now
maybe they'll understand, although I mentioned in the top of this story, and I don't know if you heard me, but the MSNBCs of the world, the Foxes of the world, the New York Times of the world, the CNNs of the world, they totally don't give context to this story. They don't do what you and I are doing. They just say essentially, China bad, U.S. good. There's more to it than that, isn't there?
Absolutely. There's a historical portion of it. China endured their years of humiliation, what they call the years of humiliation under America rule. And so now MSNBC, CNN, they were saying that Americans should not kowtow to China. That isn't really fair when you think of what happened to China back then. There was the years of humiliation to America as well. And this is not kowtowing, it's simply showing respect.
It's two sides to every story, and unfortunately on many U.S. affiliates and networks and newspapers, you only get the one side. I'm glad we got you, Christy. That's great. Fantastic explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you haven't heard that we're the ones covering the stories that you won't see covered anywhere else? In Venezuela, Kazakhstan, let's go to Hong Kong. And the media reaction to that has been crickets. How about the way we cover those stories? What the hell does that mean? Huawei, Huawei, Huawei. That's the key word in this case, uprising. Keep? Can you believe that? Watching. This is the right thing for members of the media to do, to actually pick sides. Look, if you like what you see, subscribe.